The Last Pair of Leather, Part 1. This is Corden, and he was a shoemaker. He loved the smell of fine leather and the steady tap, tap, tap of his hammer. This is his wife, Alara. They lived happily in a tiny house with a shop below. They were hard workers and kind neighbors. But the truth was, times were very hard. People weren't buying new shoes, and Corden and Alara had very little money left. They had used almost all their fine leather. "Oh, Corden," sighed Alara. "We only have enough leather for one last pair of shoes. If no one buys them, I don't know what we'll do." Corden patted her hand. "Then it must be the very best pair of shoes I have ever made, my dear. We will trust that tomorrow brings us hope." Corden took his sharpest knife and, with great care, cut the single piece of leather into all the tiny parts for one pair of shoes. He worked until the moon shone high in the sky. He laid all the little shapes out on his bench, ready to be stitched and hammered into a finished shoe in the morning. Everything was prepared perfectly. "Tomorrow," he promised the bits of leather, "I will put you together into something wonderful." He hung up his apron and slowly walked upstairs to join his wife. Corden and Alara slept soundly, tucked under their quilt. Downstairs, the little workshop was perfectly still, waiting for the sun to rise. But as the moon rose higher and the shadows danced outside, Alara opened one eye just a little bit. Did she hear a tiny snip-snip, or was it just the wind whispering secrets? Alara crept out from under the quilt. Her heart thumped a quiet rhythm. Thump-tap, thump-tap. She tiptoed to the edge of the stairs, peeking down into the shadows of the workshop. What she saw made her gasp, but silently. Tiny, bright lanterns hung from the workbench, and 4 little workers, no bigger than her thumb, were stitching and hammering the leather bits. They were quick as hummingbirds and neat as pins. One hammered a tiny heel, another stitched the long seam, and 2 others polished the toes until they shone like chestnuts. Alara watched until the very last stitch was placed. Then, whoosh, just before the first hint of morning light, the little lanterns went out, and the tiny workers vanished. "Corden, Corden, wake up," she whispered, shaking her husband awake. "You must come downstairs. Something wonderful has happened." Corden hurried down the stairs and froze. There, sitting perfectly finished on his workbench, was the most beautiful pair of leather shoes he had ever seen. They were perfect. He ran his hand over the smooth, polished leather. But I didn't stitch them," he whispered, turning them over. "The work is far finer than I could have done." Just then, a wealthy traveler stopped at the shop door. He saw the shoes and gasped, "What magnificent craftsmanship! I must have them." The traveler paid Corden a pile of silver coins for the shoes, more money than the couple had seen in months. Corden and Alara ran straight to the leather market. That evening, Corden carefully cut out the pieces for 2 new pairs of shoes, leaving the leather ready on the bench. "We must find out who is helping us tonight," said Alara with a twinkle in her eye. The moon was high and round, casting long, spooky shadows across the workshop floor. Corden and Alara blew out the candle and tiptoed to their hiding spot behind a giant stack of wooden boxes. "Shh," whispered Alara, holding her breath. The silence was thick and heavy, broken only by the drip-drip of a leaky faucet. They waited and waited. The minutes felt as long as hours. Just as Corden's head began to droop, a faint tinkling sound floated up from the bench. Then, 4 tiny spots of light, lanterns no bigger than hazelnuts, flickered to life. 4 tiny figures in little brown tunics zipped onto the workbench. They didn't have to cut the leather. Corden had done that, but they took the pieces and began stitching with unbelievable speed. They worked without a word, their hands a blur of motion. One pulled the leather tight, Another hammered the heel pegs with quick, precise taps, and 2 others buffed the new soles until they smelled like fresh honey. Corden nudged Alara and mouthed the word, "Elves!" He watched them with a warmth spreading through his chest, forgetting his own worries as he saw their intense, happy concentration. Alara smiled. "They must be cold," she whispered, her voice barely a puff of air. "They don't have enough clothes for this chilly workshop. And they look hungry." Corden nodded quickly. In what seemed like a single breath, the last buckle was secured, the tools were put away, and the little lanterns blinked out. Whoosh! The elves vanished as quickly and silently as they had come. Corden and Alara waited until they heard the first sleepy bird song. They stepped out from their hiding place and walked to the bench, gazing at the beautiful shoes. "They are perfect, Corden," Alara said, her voice soft with awe. "Now we know our helpers, and we know what we must do." Corden smiled, picking up the tiniest piece of velvet he could find. Corden and Alara knew exactly what they must do. The fine velvet from the last pair of shoes was just enough. Corden started to cut out 4 tiny tunics, and Alara quickly fashioned 4 pairs of adorable little trousers and hats. All day, the shop was busy, not with shoemaking, but with tailoring. Alara found a basket of plump, leftover blackberries and baked the smallest, sweetest honey cakes she had ever made. "These will keep their little hands warm," Corden said, carefully stitching a pocket onto a tiny brown tunic. He was not a tailor, but he had never concentrated so hard on a piece of work in his life. As the last light faded, they carried the small clothes and the sweet feast to the workbench. They arranged the 4 outfits neatly in a row next to the little cakes, a welcoming gift. "Do you think they will like them?" whispered Alara as they settled into their hiding spot. Corden just squeezed her hand. "They are perfect, Alara. Absolutely perfect." The hour grew late. The leaky faucet dripped its slow tune. Then, just like before, the tinkling sound of little bells announced their arrival. 4 tiny lanterns flickered to life. The 4 tiny elves stopped instantly. They didn't see leather to cut or shoes to stitch. They saw the velvet clothes. They saw the piles of sweet, warm honey cakes. "Oh my," whispered the fastest worker. "New clothes and a feast." The little elves cheered a tiny, joyful cheer that was sweeter than any bird song. They threw off their thin, old brown tunics and quickly pulled on the soft, new velvet. The little hats fit perfectly, and the trousers kept their legs wonderfully warm. They didn't touch a single tool. Instead, they sat down right on the workbench and began a tiny feast. Munching on honey cakes, they laughed and talked, their work forgotten. Corden and Alara watched until the last crumb was gone, and the elves were sleepy. "Our friends know we care," Corden whispered. "They are happy and free, and that is a greater gift than any gold." With a final, cheerful wave to the empty corner of the workshop, the 4 elves vanished, leaving behind only 4 crumbs and a feeling of pure, sparkling joy. Corden and Alara went to bed, their worries long gone.